consistency and assurance consistency. For example, with regard to scientific consistency, are we following the proper procedures in designing the algorithm? In terms of application consistency, whether when we apply the model, is it giving the same results across different settings? As part of stakeholder consistency, are we involving all the people, all the regulators when we are developing the model? For example, in Australia, we don't have any cloud law. I think no other country has got a particular cloud law. The cloud industry is booming at the moment. Amazon Web Services is one of the leading fields in the cloud. Now, with regard to cloud law, because we don't have any specific cloud law, we basically focus on Australian consumer law, which is basically Privacy Act 1988, Spam Act 2004, and we have got Australian Consumer and Competition Act 2010. So we basically focus on these three types of laws when we talk about stakeholder consistency, whether stakeholders are aligned. All the laws are aligned when we develop these algorithms. Assurance consistency is basically focusing on privacy, security, this sort of issues with regard to algorithms. So these are the priority methods we proposed as part of the research. And as part of the post hoc methods, that means if algorithm bias happens, then what should we do? How could we fix that problem? Because it might cause millions of dollars losses to a corporation or a firm. So as part of this, we have basically proposed 6 steps. Identification of the problem, what problem it is causing. Review that and audit that problem based on past findings and also on the context. Fixing relevant variables, neutralizing relevant variables. Development of an ethical, responsible AI model by diverse teams. Robust analysis of the training data. And finally, we have proposed that act on insights or improve the model based on stakeholders' feedback. So these are the 6 steps we have proposed based on different examples and applications on post hoc basis on how to address algorithm bias. So this is what we have got, what I have got at this stage with regard to algorithm bias. The research is still ongoing. We are at the moment collecting data on a large scale, trying to develop a model development cycle for dealing with algorithm bias, which is going to be huge, by the way, by next few years' time because of the emerging growth of AI across all the countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shah. We're going to move on to the next speaker, whom on my diary here is Tyler Sweatt, but he has sent in a pre-record and we'll play the pre-records at the end. Let's go to David Troy, whom I think I can see. David, do you have co-hosting rights where you can share your screen, or you're just going to talk?
I believe I do. I believe I do, and I'm going to go ahead and start that now.
Great.
Can you guys see this okay?
Beautiful.
Great.
Okay, so I wanted to try to just really briefly outline a little bit different model about thinking about the disinformation problem, which has become so pervasive, and to really frame it in the terms of social capital. And I think that that's kind of a, an unusual way of thinking about it. We've been thinking about it more in terms of what people believe rather than about the kinds of relationships that they maintain with others. So what got me into this was I started doing study of social networks in the context of cities. So I started looking at all the Twitter users in Baltimore several years ago and started to realize that there was a great deal of very obvious social segregation between different groups in the city. So if you look at this kind of as, what kinds of people reside where, I'm sort of over on the very far right of this, kind of in the second E in geeks there. And then, you look on the opposite end of the map and there's a lot of younger people, mostly African-American, who are into different things than I am. And it was a little bit of a revelation when I started to kind of do these kinds of maps of different cities. And I've done, maps like this from all around the world. And what you find is that in general, the same kind of pattern applies, where you end up with this kind of sociographic sort of homophilia, where people are drawn to, similar topics based on kind of their socioeconomic and race and, educational background, et cetera. And, you actually could think, well, this might be actually a good thing to try to address and to bring people closer together across some of these divides. But what I started to find when I started to look at the disinformation problem going into 2016 and 2017 was that, this was really something that was being used to run psyops and to divide people further. And not only that, we tend to think about our individual selves as being, having agency and having individual beliefs, but in fact, we are very much shaped by the people around us. So what this kind of led me to was an insight that said, these things actually kind of also resemble cults and cultish kinds of constructs. So if you think about like, Jonestown being kind of the canonical cult, but then also you have kind of cultish formations like, a mafia, like you have in The Godfather, or the Salem witch trials, where, things are kind of going off the rails because people are sort of organizing themselves in cultish ways. You start to wonder, how could we start to describe some of this stuff mathematically? And I've got much longer talks that I can do on this, but I wanted to just really quickly inoculate you all with this idea that you can think about this problem in this way. And so if you think about this as being kind of the classic cult construct, where there's social capital that exists between a leader and then all of the members, and between all of the members with each other. And if you think about a sort of more healthy society as being one in which there are lots of different factions that have social capital distributed across those factions, you can start to see that there are also kind of intermediary constructs like this one, where it's sort of, you've got lots of sort of factions that are not really talking to each other, and it's a little bit less healthy. And then ultimately you've got a construct like this, where people are divided into very distinct factions that are not connected to each other at all. Now, obviously this doesn't really happen in the real world, but we're getting pretty close in the United States, at least. Where we are becoming very, very divided in terms of social capital. So if you think about disinformation within this context, what it tends to do is to divide us into very hardened in-groups and out-groups, and it creates clear boundaries between those groups. It also tends to induce excess social capital within those groups, which makes us more predisposed to violence and towards dismissing the existence of other groups, which is a very cultish tendency. And it also causes cognitive errors in our ability to make decisions as a group. And lastly, I think you can argue that it turns the idea of truth into kind of a personal position rather than just something that we can objectively agree on. So if you think about somebody who's been inculcated into something like the flat earth movement, those folks are, pretty far along on the radicalization front in terms of, what all sorts of things have they had to reject to become deeply embedded in this? Family, friends, common notions of science, regular kinds of educational notions about, how the world works. This is a very extreme kind of position. So I think you can make an argument that radicalization is kind of what occurs when your local in-group values override larger societal values. So when we are configured in this kind of manner, when we're all in these little separate bubbles of social capital, it renders us less able to deal with problems like this, where we all need to be organized against what you might consider to be superordinating goals, and that's not productive for society. So I would argue that we need to be thinking about solving the disinformation problem by really addressing this social capital issue and figuring out how to messy society in ways that make us more connected socially. And if you think about the individual, we are not just a product of like our ideology and beliefs, and that's not the place where disinformation operates. In fact, disinformation operates on social identity and social capital, which in turn informs ideology and beliefs, and these things are all in dialogue with each other. So my personal opinion is that we need to start looking at things like national service as ways of scrambling social capital to make us more resilient and to create deterrence against population-centered attacks. We are not really looking at that in a deep way with disinformation yet. We're focused kind of on platforms and AI, which I think are hugely important. But if we don't understand how those kinds of things interact with social capital and what kind of society we build based on those kinds of algorithms, I think we will be, very much delayed in addressing this problem. So I just wanted to bring this to everybody's attention as something to be thinking about, and I'd be happy to talk with any of you or collaborate with any of you on this topic. So thank you.
Absolutely riveting, Dave. I know you're going to have a swarm of questions, and we're definitely visiting your website. That's peoplemaps.org, correct?
Yeah, I don't have a lot there right now. I've been working on disinformation stuff kind of in a dark mode at the moment, but I can direct you to some resources.
Awesome. We have lots of questions. Our next speaker is the brilliant Sara Jordan. Sara, remind us, is it the University of Virginia? I just can't remember which university it is. I should know this off by heart. I know which NGO you're part of, but
yeah. So good evening, morning, whatever. Good Earth Day. Sara Jordan. I work for Virginia Tech and Future Privacy Forum. And so what I'm going to speak to you briefly about is a social problem with AI implications, at least in terms of the designs that we take on AI. And that is the problem of how do we solve privacy? How do we engineer privacy effectively? And one of the biggest sort of points of advocacy that we find in terms of the privacy community is creating opportunities for people to hold their data to themselves. So data localization at the micro level, not necessarily at the national level. We'll talk about data nationalization at some other point, but holding our data personal to ourselves and then using that data to train all of the applications that we enjoy. And what this is typically called is federated machine learning. And federated machine learning is where essentially you take these big giant models of the ensemble of models and you parcel them out into components and you push them to people through their many smartphone devices. You break out your cell phone and your cell phone essentially receives a piece of a model, learns what you expect from, say, Gboard, from typing, predictive typing, from predictive text, from speech to text, from text to speech, all of those stuff that you do. And your phone trains that model on itself and sends those gradients back to the main server model so that it can update itself. Well, as one might predict, this says an excellent idea in theory. It works really well in some research environments, but in the actual live application, when we start talking about high dimensional models, when we start talking about high security applications, there may be a bit of breakdown. And that breakdown happens at a couple of different known points. And those points are commonly known for those people who are in the cybersecurity realm as, well, a central server is always a attack surface. But each of these particular nodes, every time there's a transmission, is another attack surface. Every one of these users is another attack surface. Their devices are an attack surface. And, well, just as our previous presenter said, the person itself operating that system can themselves be a form of attack surface if they've already been, well, reprogrammed or poorly programmed through their social context to start uploading essentially what is adversarial data or adversarial findings back to the central nodes, back to the central network. And as we might expect, at each point of the central server, the data aggregators, your cell phones, right, and those other components of your cell phones, the apps that you upload or download or deploy on your phone, there's additional third-party, fourth-party data transmission things that may create additional and often hidden forms of attack surfaces for things like model inversion attacks, right? Data poisoning attacks, model poisoning attacks, model theft. So the first speaker pointed out issues of AI bias, but in this context of talking about the national security implications of some of these social goods or social ills, social technology, the opportunities for things that we don't necessarily consider as proximate threats to ourselves, but are proximate threats to nation state status or to the integrity of nation states, things like corporate espionage or systematic data exfiltration, say by parties like North Korea, who really loves vaccination data right now, right, and trying to gather that from different nations, is a form of, well, it's a form of attack surface, it's a form of national security threat. And importantly, in the machine learning and discussions, we're often talking about consumer federated learning. Well, essentially, how do we create another Gboard? Or how do we keep HIPAA data or health data private to users so that we're not transmitting these and creating opportunities for data breaches? But in fact, the uses of AI and federated learning in business is greater and greater. So some of the main things that you may use in your own business enterprise, not only your email systems, but your file sharing systems, identity verification systems are often trained in terms of federated learning. And that creates a very unique attack surface for things like corporate espionage, university attacks. So for those of you who can't access your server without it going bonkers, you can probably blame federated learning and federated learning attacks at some point. And all of these may lead to things like data poisoning, model poisoning. For those of you who are paying close attention to the AI space, you'll know that some of these giant models are not only environmentally costly to train in terms of their energy costs, but are economically costly to train. I read a piece this morning that the next big natural language processing application is probably going to cost us in the order of $1 billion. Think about the sheer economic value that is lost when we deal with model poisoning or data poisoning or training data exposure, to reflect on what the first speaker says. So this is all about privacy, though. The whole reason you would create a federated learning architecture is to solve this social problem of making privacy. And while I don't have, I think, a great explanation for how we sort of solve this problem, I think it's necessary that we start to think about the possibility of cybersecurity and integrating the cybersecurity and the AI space more tightly together to solve, well, essentially to close the windows on the federated learning side is a next step. So a couple of different solutions. Step one, that NIST privacy security framework, they are going together. We need to make sure that cybersecurity and machine learning engineers are speaking the same language. We want the same things. We want secure models with integrity. Time to start talking and working with one another. Moving federated learning from a toy problem to a more well-developed use case in terms of the integration of cybersecurity into AI. For example, just as the first speaker highlighted, there's a lot of well-known cases in terms of AI ethics and algorithmic bias. There's not very good use cases in terms of where federated learning has gone wrong. We all appreciate the fact that Gboard helps us to be able to type our emails faster, but if you've ever had to type a text to somebody that says, I'm stuck in traffic, right, and it keeps giving you ducking or sucking, then you know that federated learning may not necessarily always be working in the ways we intended. It's a funny use case, but think about the other implications of this. There are going to be silos, there are going to be communities, as our previous speaker just pointed out, who are going to be training models in particular ways. And if those get stuck in a community type of feedback loop, there is then reiteration of that language where you're essentially adversarially training your model by sending it back to the same people for the same updates without exposing it to a different form of parameter surface. I think that has the possibility of actually collapsing us even further and restricting our communities in the same way that one of the previous speakers on the previous discussion talked about, in sort of reducing diversity. Next, we can talk about the implications of this for advertising. So Google pointed out that to get around the walled gardens of advertising, they're going to be talking about using federated learning of cohorts for ad models. Okay, this is going to be interesting. If you're not a giant player like a Google, if you're not a giant player like Amazon, who can successfully flock people and securitize those flocks, what is it that we're essentially opening ourselves up for? And finally, and this is something that I think the MITRE folks were making clear, and the previous speakers throughout the day have made clear, it's about interdisciplinarity, getting your CISOs, getting your privacy officers, getting your machine learning engineers to actually talk to one another in a same and shared language, and to be able to even talk to network architects and supercomputation experts to make sure that they understand what it is we're doing and what the genuine attack surfaces are for each and what the goals are for each, so that we can close all the windows and doors that need to be in order to create truly to create models with true integrity. And to me, I'm worried that until it's the case that there is a massive attack on a federated learning system with large scale businesses, this is not going to be a problem that's elevated. We're just going to keep flogging the idea that federated learning and differential privacy solves privacy. And we're going to keep setting up these systems thinking we're solving a social good, when in fact we're creating more spaces for social ills. So that is all I had to bring to you this evening. You can find me in a couple different places at Virginia Tech as well as Future Privacy Forum. But let me turn it back over to you, Katina, so we can get on to the next speakers and possibly some questions.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for staying up so late. It is getting on there anywhere in the US. You're actually our only female speaker for this track, the tech track. Shah has had to catch a train, to my knowledge. But he really did want to introduce you, Marcus Wiggin. Marcus is an Oxford graduate from the 70s, I believe, if I have his biography correct in my mind. You can correct me. And you're a good rower, I know that. And physics graduate from Oxford, and so much more. A mentor and someone who's done a lot to be here today. I won't go into the details, just to say a big thank you for your presence throughout the whole day. It's really added to the workshop. And you were our second keynote speaker in 2007.
How do I get these slides up?
I'm gonna, okay, so down the bottom, there should be a share screen. It's a green, if you hover towards the bottom of the dialog, got it? That's it. Then click the share.
So what do I, yep, I've done that.
Find your PowerPoint or your Word document or your PDF if it's already open.
It is already open, but it doesn't seem to want to find it. I'm not going to waste any more time.
Okay, go ahead, Marcus. Thank you.
Allow it to share the screen. Well, maybe it'll work.
Yes.
Oh, forget it. Time is more important than that. I haven't lectured or talked about AI since 1990, after about 10 years working in expert systems and neural nets. So all of this has an element of, this is the next generation and people are looking at it differently. However, this isn't quite true. I was looking at the problems of people and privacy and perception in the late 70s and 80s. And finally, we're all looking at it. Now, what is the single thing that we all encounter? The medical system. Right, so I chose to look at the medical system as an example of where AI and engagement and the socio-technical systems need to be looked at from a different angle. You may or may not have heard of the term QALY, quality life adjusted years. It's a way of saying that if halfway through a treatment, you're in agony and you can't walk far, and it's about 0.1 of what you would hope for, then when you add all these up, you get QALYs which are a lot less than a total of 1. These are used a great deal in public health. But what is the key feature? The key feature is that it's historical. These are measured by looking for samples and choices and responses of people to questions along a treatment cycle and in different populations. By the way, they define quality as mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain, discomfort, anxiety, and depression. Note that rather restricted space, but it's useful. However, this is about the limit of patient engagement in the process. So what happens when we get a modern situation? The first thing that happens is the data flows climb up exponentially. Where do they come from? The first place they come from is from embedded systems. I've got a pacemaker here, continuously monitored. People monitor their insulin levels. People monitor their ECGs and blood pressures and VO2, and this is current, and the number of these things is rising. What does this mean? It means that during treatments, there is a massive data flow that's highly individual. Secondary factor, it's got communications. Well, I suppose we could take a novel approach and actually ask the patients, how they're getting on and what their priorities are. This isn't done. Let me give you an example where we wish it was done. Advanced care directives, which are end of life or treatment directives, you think they're any good? Well, they aren't actually fully legally enforced. But if somebody asked you when you're in extremis, do you want to survive for another 6 months in extreme pain or not? And the answer is, I want to see the birth of my first grandchild. You all know that many people will somehow hang on for that. This completely destroys the basis of the QALY approach. Well, it's not surprising because it's a real-time system in which the system includes both the patient and the treatment. Second component, the data flows both about people and from people are rising exponentially. DNA analyses and precision medicine is starting to penetrate quite significantly. Now, what is the last key point? We're talking about socio-technical systems. So what are patients engaged with? Well, you might be surprised to learn that clinicians find that around 70% of the people they're treating, less than half are engaged in their process. And 42%, less than 25%. This is an extremely low level of engagement. There are considerable potentials in improving that from all points of view. So that's my first slide. Just looking to see where I put the other one. When you have this level of data flow, if you're using it, you're changing the balance between and the engagements between medical treatment professionals and the patients. We haven't used that yet. We will. We are beginning to. And it causes different questions to be asked. One example is I'm having to do extensive research on pacemaker magnetic sensitivity, which is not mentioned in almost any area. And it's extremely important for obvious reasons. I drop dead if it stops. We need better two-way communication. Now, can we do it? The answer is yes, we can. We have the communication processes. We have the data flows. We have the monitoring going on. We're simply not using it. So let us assume that we seek greater engagements, which will modify both the treatment procedures and the manner in which they're communicated, and probably vastly improve the level of patient engagement with their treatment, which usually improves the quality of the outcomes. What happens? People get very nervous about the security of these ever more sensitive data streams. And they're pretty widespread. Remember that if you're using precision medicine, DNA also picks up your entire family. So it is not quite as simple as saying you are engaged. It is your family gets engaged. The other point is that when you consider the level and frequency of these flows, the number of points of vulnerability to third-party interception and utilization, particularly if AI is used so people aren't quite sure what is being deduced, they start rising. And the last question is the one that really turns the knife. Who owns which part of this data? Do you own your data? Does the treatment own the data? Does the analyst who's doing the AI to deduce what treatments do and how are going to sell the results, do they own it? Who owns it? Because under the current situation, you certainly don't. It's just all about you. So we have this interesting position where medicine is driving headlong into a new form of engagement with the patients. And you are all feeding it. You with your Fitbits and Apple Watches, you're feeding all this. When it gets all pulled together, do you think we're going to change the culture? We should. But unless we formulate the questions and formulate the demand, it will remain. Let us use historical outcome data and tell you what is going to happen. and the monitoring data is just a convenience. We can change it. We should change it. AI will have an enormous contribution in this. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking presentation, even though we couldn't see your two slides. Very clear, concise, and leaves us with much food for thought. We had a comment there by Sara in the chat window saying if you co-joined your approach and your discussion with hers, it would be extremely complex and also powerful in terms of what's possible. But I do have to go to a pre-recorded presentation. Please persist. It's a very good summary, in fact, by Trevor Sweatt. I hope I got his name correct. And I'm going to share the window right now. So Tyler, not Trevor, forgive me. I should have got that right. Tyler Sweatt.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tyler Sweatt. I'm here to talk to you about artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and some of the challenges surrounding it. Goes without saying that we've seen a significant rise in artificial intelligence capabilities in the last decade, driven heavily by a rise in data access, at the exabyte level, and significant developments in compute capability, allowing a democratization of a number of capabilities that were once reserved for large institutions. While artificial intelligence certainly brings with it new capabilities, new insights, and the promise of even more societal advancement, the truth is it also comes with some significant challenges, which are often glossed over, focusing on the potential upside of the capability. We're going to explore a couple of those today, and also talk about the underlying issue of trust in these systems, commonly referred to as human-machine teaming or human-machine interaction. So as we think about some of the differences between artificial intelligence and traditional software capabilities, a lot of it comes from an understanding of the system and how it functions, the ability to interrogate it and explain it, and the ability to visualize it. In most artificial intelligence systems right now, the user is simply seeing an output or a recommendation, whereas for more traditional software capabilities, you're able to explore code base and understand it while you're interrogating it. Additionally, in an artificial intelligence system, an AI system, you're depending heavily on the training data and how that was collected, how that was cataloged and cleaned. That brings with it a huge risk around bias. You're depending on collection methods and then the ability to go interrogate that data and understand the provenance and the life cycle of it. It was not only time consuming, it is often nearly impossible. And finally, we see issues around robustness, specifically in the face of adversarial machine learning. To put it simply, AI systems can be hacked. There are ways to compromise the data, so the fuel that you're running the system on, or what you're teaching the model can be compromised through a data poisoning attack. There are attacks such as evasion attacks, which are, to give you a simple example, using perturbation engines to circumvent or evade malware classifiers. And there are also privacy attacks, which are allowing you to extract information from the model and gain more insights on it, almost like pen testing and probing. So why does that matter? While we've seen this massive growth over the last decade in compute and in data availability, we've also seen an exponential increase in research, peer-reviewed journals on adversarial machine learning and ways to exploit the fragility of these systems. And that's just the peer review. That's not counting, adversaries, different nation state sponsored transnational criminal organizations, or terrorist groups, quite frankly. So you take the rise in data, the new capability, the ability to do more, to go faster, with a rise of research around the threat landscape and ways to exploit. And then we put that together in a system that's inherently difficult to explain, and a capability that's often glossed over. So while most folks think, many business leaders will think, hey, I could just sprinkle some AI on it and generate an insight. When it comes down to it, and we're in highly regulated industries or security decisions, and we've got to achieve trust to be able to derive the benefits. For many reasons, organizations tend to not focus on the human machine teaming aspect and understanding how to provide context into the results and the outputs and the process for which those outputs were generated by the system. Often leaving, a business owner, a business unit leader, or the problem owner unable to provide a logical decision or a logical justification on the decision that was recommended by the system, creating further barriers to adoption in already complex systems. So to put simply, 3 areas to focus on: bias in the data, explainability of the system, of the model, and robustness of the system, all wildly important, but we must focus on creating both technical and non-technical rationale to help justify those, to increase adoption by both cybersecurity professionals and business leaders alike to truly achieve the benefits that artificial intelligence provides. Thank you. Have a great day.
You're on mute.
Thanks, Dave. We've got one more video by Colby Hollabau, who is a Master's in Public Interest Technology student, and he works for an NGO and is currently the operations manager of that NGO looking into marine center stuff. And I wanted to juxtapose this from a technical solution because he's talking about point of view cameras, but I want you to take this in the context of the larger landscape of security and privacy. But token, he's talking about sea lions, and he calls the sea lions patients. So let me share my screen very quickly. It's a bit of an intervention on my part to have this talk, but I'm very happy that Colby actually spent time on the pre-record. He's from Orange County. Let me just make sure this is going to work. So, oh. Sorry, team. If you don't press that little button in the corner, it just won't work. There we go, share sound. Here we go.
I'm the operations manager at Pacific Marine Mammal Center, as well as a graduate student at Arizona State University in their Public Interest Technology program. On the screen before you, you see the Pacific Marine Mammal Center's incredible wildlife streaming camera and 3 sea lion patients swimming around. And it's about these cameras I want to talk today. And I want to specifically speak on the dangers these cameras can pose wildlife animals. As this topic has been explored around animals in the wild, I want to focus this talk on the harm streaming cameras can pose to wild animals in rescue and rehabilitation facilities like ours. Well, we have seen cameras like these bring joy to countless people and allow rescue organizations to better share the stories of the animals in our care. There are potential avenues for people to use the data gained from these cameras to harm the animals they are trying to save. When discussing the distribution of live streaming cameras, our focus will be on the publicly available platforms such as Twitch, YouTube, Explore.org, etc. These are major areas where information is being captured in large quantities. Think Twitch clips. And there's little barrier for entry. Over the course of interviews with marine mammal scientists and veterinarians, I was able to identify 2 main areas of concern in sharing animal videos over these platforms. Data repurposing, such as if someone sees our patients, then uses what they have seen to cause harm, such as noticing a caretaker's schedule and using that to enter the enclosures. The other is that of data spillover, where we capture and stream something that was meant to remain private. It is well known that animal tracking data has been repurposed by animal persecution groups to seek out animals to harm, often poaching. However, I also want to consider how, when successful, wildlife streaming cameras turn wild animals into web stars. In fact, in the case of a live streaming camera for a bald eagle nest, it became so popular that they had to coordinate off the area and actually patrol it. So while it is fantastic, these extremely enthusiastic fans love and support the animals so much, in a rescue context, this can cause a lot of harm. If a fan were to enter a facility and harass the animal, or feel that because they've seen the animal act so gently and playfully, like you see behind you, that if you were to enter the enclosure, you could share similar experience with them, could really harm both the person and the animal. So it is important we consider what this data could be repurposed for. It could be as simple as someone considering that the animals are more approachable in the wild. Now, aside from what people could learn to and then use against the animals, is also the concern of data spillover around the privacy rights of our animal caretakers and around animal medical events. To start, the inherent work of an animal rescue organization means that the animals under our care are often suffering from a medical illness or an injury. This will show itself through scars, deformities, seizures, or sometimes death. Well, these type of medical events and injuries are a reality for people who work in animal rescue. This could be hard to watch for the general public. And without explanation of what's going on, it can seem cruel. And further, the animal caretakers deserve their privacy as well as they move in and out of the enclosures. So there are valid concerns of data being repurposed by an avid fan or a medical event being seen out of context. These can be overcome by rescue organizations through well thought out streaming camera deployments. An example by our organization, Pacific Marine Mammal Center, will be installing and labeling camera turnoff switch, empowering animal care personnel the ability to turn off the camera in the event of an emergency. However, what is most important is that organizations who roll out these live streaming cameras to share our patients' stories are constantly reflective of how much good is being caused or how much good happens for the patient by streaming these stories and in the greater community. And then also understanding that there could be some bad and helping account for that. I look forward to the future discussion around this topic. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, team, for the patience of listening to the two pre-records. Opening to the floor for the next 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Anyone to anyone.
I was struck by the complementarity of what I'm talking about and what Sara was talking about. In one case, it was talking about how some of these systems are being used. And I was talking about the socio-technical structures and organizational changes and frames within which they're being used. Reference back to the global standard for public sector, public health assessment, which is QALY. Just seemed to me that this is the kind of workshop where you end up by working with somebody else you hadn't expected.
Yeah, one of those areas that really people are talking about uses of FL a lot is in healthcare data. I've got serious concerns about it. We keep saying we want to do that in order to maintain privacy of personal healthcare data, but many of those opportunities for people to sort of create control of their health is through an app, and that app is then used to train particular systems that are not only open to intrusion, open to attack, but are also really, there's a lot of chances to create reinforcement loops of behavior and to create nudges and sludge behavior, to create disinformation channels and perpetuation of disinformation channels, as David was talking about, by hardening some of those systems. It seems like a great idea. I understand where they're going, but I don't think that the actual risks of the architecture itself have been really closely examined yet.
I have a quick question for the group. In my experience, the more people know about what technology is, the more scared they are. I used to write EULAs and user license agreements, and I read them. And when I go to European sites and they say we use cookies, I look at the cookies that they use and I select the ones that are not discretionary. But I write extensively about the fact that nobody reads the EULAs on these phones, and these phones are giving out gigabytes of data per month on people. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but my point is the smarter the people I know are about the risks, the more freaked out they are. Am I wrong there? I mean, are there? I mean, I don't mean, maybe we're just a self-selected group of people who tend to be more concerned about these technologies, but I appreciate these conversations.
No, I started getting deeply concerned back when I was still working inside, let's say, like the National Security Agency. This was long time ago. And I realized the amount of data that's available, even on commercial markets, and how we interact with our technology. I won't say mindlessly, but like at least without consent in many cases, because we're so inured by the capability that we don't stop and think about the long-term consequences of providing information. So yeah, I too have a tinfoil hat that I put on sometimes. Yeah.
And there's an equity issue implied in what you just said. You said maybe not mindlessly, but the truth is my daughters don't read EULAs, and that's a generational thing. But I would also suspect that some of the communities at risk that David was talking about, I actually spent a lot of time going through the research on the EULAs, and like Google's EULA is shorter than Facebook's, but it has the intellectual complexity of 17th century like scientific tome. Literally, PhDs and lawyers aren't qualified to read these EULAs and make informed consent. I'm not arguing for legislation. I'm saying that there's a level of informed consent now that there's a laziness that maybe you and I, the folks on this call, might have for not reading those things. But for everybody else, it's almost like nonsensical for them to spend the time doing it because it doesn't help them at all. And they want that discount, so they're going to click on the thing anyways because they want to get that 50% off.
If I could speak to that for just a second, I think part of the issue is that there's an asymmetric risk factor. Like at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether I personally am, signing off on these things and giving away my data because, my life personally is probably not going to be individually affected very much by that decision. But the effect on society or on marginalized groups is much more, that has much more potential to cause harm. And we saw that with, Cambridge Analytica, with January 6th. I mean, all of those things were caused by adverse reactions from aggregation of data, for lack of a better frame. And I think that that's something that people just feel like, they think that this is about protecting themselves. This is about protecting society.
I think it's also interesting right now, as students are learning from home remotely. At least the school district that my children go to here in Virginia, they wanted us all to purchase Chromebooks. I was like, well, how about like a Pine Book with Brave? Because I really don't want my kids to have that level of internet footprint at the age that they're at. Because by buying a Chromebook, you're inherently going to be using Google services. Google services is collecting data on you. Likewise, access to my local government organizations, many of them require Facebook accounts because that's their website. And I'm like, well, I really prefer not to be on Facebook, but I can't even scroll through the whole page unless I log in. And I don't think anybody's really spent the time to think about what they're doing, from a economic governmental perspective when they do these things. And I think that's one of the larger narratives that probably needs to be explored a little bit further.
I'm really interested in how we start to write EULAs that actually accommodate some of the privacy things that we're trying to do. So for example, how do we know when we're at, how do I explain a vertical federated learning system to an end user, right? How do I explain differential privacy to an end user? If I say privacy budget, most people, go blank. If I say, delta between two data sets, they're going to be, huh? Right? That's a problem. Then explaining how those things change over time and how they aggregate things like insertion of DP into an FL system, insertion of a HE system into all of that. That complexity becomes so overwhelming for people who are even experts at this stuff that it's seems to be virtually impossible to wind back the clock to make these more simple, but yet it seems like that's absolutely incumbent upon us to figure out how to do. What aggravates me sometimes is that people say, well, let's just increase STEM education. Oh, really? How's that going to solve this problem?
If I could dovetail in there, because that's, I mean, the value of what Katina is creating here in terms of the forum. First of all, let's recognize that we're 2 degrees removed from the corridors of power here, right? I mean, my biggest customer is Samsung, and I've worked for very many big companies in the past. That's a corridor of power. I've worked with the DoD and the DHS. That's a corridor of power. There's like the vendors who are the influencers and lobbyists, and there's Congress. Right now we're in an academic backwater, and by the way, Katina, I'm greatly appreciative for this forum, but we're very far removed from the corridors of power. But we're having exactly the right kinds of conversation, because you could have a EULA that said everything that you wanted to say in plain language that, you know, somebody with an 11th grade education could understand, and at the bottom it would say, and we reserve the rights to make the change, to change these automatically, you know, unilaterally. And if they weren't a lawyer, they wouldn't recognize that everything that they just understood was meaningless, because once it gets posted, it could all be changed. So you have to have both technical competence and legal competence. It's really friggin' hard stuff. And here we are kind of getting a grasp of it in an interdisciplinary